In the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire controlled territory stretching from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf. It commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. It administered populations of tens of millions. It collected taxes from 3 continents. And yet, at that same moment, a single city on the northern edge of the Adriatic Sea was generating revenues that rivaled the Ottoman treasury. That city had no territorial empire, no vast agricultural heartland, no mineral wealth beneath its foundations. It sat on water. It controlled movement, and that was enough. The pattern repeats across centuries and continents. Small coastal cities accumulating extraordinary concentrations of wealth, political leverage, and institutional sophistication, while surrounding empires, far larger in every conventional measure of power, to struggle to match them. The question is not simply historical curiosity, it is structural. What mechanism allowed a port to outperform an empire? And what does that mechanism reveal about how capital has always moved? This is historical capital. Today we examine how control over movement, not ownership of territory, became the most durable source of wealth in economic history. To understand why ports produced such extraordinary concentrations of capital, it is necessary to first understand what empires fundamentally are and where their structural limits begin. Empires are territorial institutions. Their power derives from controlling land, extracting agricultural surplus, administering populations, and projecting military force across geography. This model of wealth accumulation is ancient and familiar, but it carries an intrinsic structural constraint. Land is fixed. The wealth an empire extracts from its territory is limited by what that territory produces. To grow richer, an empire must acquire more land. To administer more land, it must expand its bureaucracy. To expand its bureaucracy, it must spend more on administration. At a certain scale, the cost of maintaining territorial control begins to consume a disproportionate share of the revenue that control was meant to generate. Empires do not collapse because they run out of territory. They collapse because administering that territory becomes more expensive than the territory is worth. Port cities operated on an entirely different structural logic. They did not accumulate wealth by owning what passed through them. They accumulated wealth by controlling access to the passage itself. A port city at a strategic choke point sits at the intersection of trade flows. Every merchant who requires passage through that point must engage with the city's infrastructure, pay its tolls, utilize its warehousing, access its credit markets, and operate within its legal framework. The city extracts value not from a fixed stock of land, but from a continuous flow of transactions. The critical distinction is this: empires controlled territory, ports controlled movement. And in economic history, movement has almost always been worth more than land. Venice understood this earlier and more deliberately than almost any other political entity in history. The city itself was geographically improbable, built across a shallow lagoon on the northeastern coast of Italy. It possessed no agricultural hinterland of consequence, no mineral resources, and no natural land routes into the European interior. What it possessed was a deep harbour, access to Adriatic sea lanes, and a location that placed it between the Byzantine East and the Latin West. From approximately the 9th century onward, Venetian merchants began formalizing their advantages. They negotiated preferential trading rights with Byzantium that no other European power possessed. They developed a galley fleet, explicitly designed for commercial efficiency rather than purely military purpose. They created institutional structures. The Colleganza contract, an early form of partnership finance that allowed merchants to pool capital for long voyages and share risk in proportion to contribution. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Venice had effectively become the clearinghouse for trade between the Mediterranean world and northern Europe. Spices, silk, and luxury goods from the east moved through Venetian warehouses. Timber, wool, and silver moved eastward in return. At each stage of that movement, Venice extracted value through tolls, warehousing fees, credit provision, currency exchange, and insurance services. The arsenal, Venice's state-owned shipyard, could produce a fully outfitted war galley in a single day at peak capacity. This was not simply military capability. It was a demonstration that Venice had institutionalized production at a scale that no rival could easily match. By the 14th century, the Venetian state had developed bond markets, a funded public debt, and sophisticated accounting practices that predated similar institutions in most European kingdoms by generations. A city of perhaps 100,000 people was at moments generating annual revenues comparable to those of the largest European monarchies. The mechanism was not conquest. It was not taxation of agricultural surplus. It was the systematic monetization of every layer of the trade flow that passed through its geographical position. 2 centuries later, a different city would refine this model further, and in doing so, lay the structural foundations of modern finance. Amsterdam in the early 17th century was the capital of a republic that had only recently won its independence from Spain. The Dutch Republic had no great empire, no territorial depth, and no monopoly on silver or gold. What it had was an extraordinarily efficient commercial and financial infrastructure concentrated in a single port city. The Dutch merchant fleet by 1620 was larger than those of England, France, and Spain combined. This was not accidental. Dutch shipbuilders had engineered a vessel type, the fluit, specifically optimized for cargo capacity over military armament. It carried more at lower cost per unit than any competing design. Lower operational cost meant thinner profit margins were commercially viable. Thinner viable margins meant Dutch merchants could undercut rivals in every market they entered. But the more consequential innovation was financial. In 1609, Amsterdam established the Wisselbank, or exchange bank. The Wisselbank allowed merchants to hold accounts denominated in a stable unit of account, settling large commercial transactions through book entries rather than physical coin transfer. It eliminated the friction of currency exchange across dozens of different European coin standards. It provided the commercial world with a reliable monetary infrastructure that no single sovereign controlled. The same year, the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, issued shares to the public on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. For the first time in recorded history, permanent capital was raised from dispersed investors for an ongoing commercial enterprise. These were not isolated innovations, they formed an interconnected system. The port generated trade flows, the trade flows generated capital. The capital was intermediated through the Wisselbank and the stock exchange. The intermediated capital financed further commercial expansion. The expansion generated more trade. The loop was self-reinforcing. Amsterdam in the 17th century demonstrated that a port city could function not merely as a node of physical trade, but as the operational center of global capital allocation. The city of fewer than 200,000 inhabitants was at that moment the financial capital of the world. The structural advantage that Venice and Amsterdam exploited rested on 4 interlocking mechanisms. The first was what economists now recognize as network effects. A port that already handles significant trade volume becomes the natural choice for additional merchants, precisely because other merchants are already there. Insurance markets develop. Credit is available. Warehousing is established. Legal precedent exists. Pilots know the harbor. the advantages compound. Entry to a rival port requires rebuilding that entire ecosystem from zero. The second mechanism was information asymmetry. Merchants in a major port had earlier and more accurate knowledge of prices, supply conditions, and political developments across trading routes than merchants located elsewhere. In an era before telecommunications, this advantage was enormous. The ability to act on reliable information before rivals were even aware of it was a sustained structural edge. The third mechanism was liquidity concentration. Capital pools in locations where capital is already present and can be deployed efficiently. A merchant in Amsterdam or Venice could secure financing for a voyage in days through established credit relationships and recognizable collateral instruments at rates that reflected the depth of the local capital market. A merchant in a smaller or more isolated center faced higher costs and slower processes, disadvantaging him in every competitive dimension. The fourth mechanism was institutional density. Ports developed legal frameworks for commercial disputes, standardized contract forms, insurance markets, and currency exchange systems precisely because the volume of commerce demanded them. This institutional infrastructure reduced transaction costs for all participants. Lower transaction costs meant more commerce was economically viable. More commerce meant greater revenue for the port. Each mechanism reinforced the others. The result was a form of commercial gravity. Capital, information, skill, and enterprise concentrated in established ports, making those ports more productive, which attracted further concentration. Breaking into this cycle from outside required not merely effort, but the deliberate construction of an entire alternative ecosystem. Empires found this difficult. They were built for territorial administration, not commercial network management. Their advantages lay in military projection and tax collection, not in the patient cultivation of institutional trust that financial markets require. The structural consequence of this divergence was durable. Port cities that achieved network centrality in major trade routes accumulated surpluses that were then recycled into further institutional development. Universities, legal systems, accounting practices, and financial instruments all developed in commercial urban centers at a pace that land-based empires could not match. This created a long-run divergence in institutional sophistication. By the 18th century, the most advanced financial, legal, and commercial institutions in the world were concentrated in a handful of port cities: London, Amsterdam, Genoa, later New York. These cities did not merely facilitate trade, they defined the terms on which global commerce operated. Empires that lacked comparable port infrastructure found themselves structurally dependent on those that possessed it, accessing capital through institutions they did not control, at rates determined by markets they did not set. The choke point had become the center of gravity. The structural logic that made Venice and Amsterdam dominant in their centuries has not disappeared. It has migrated. The geography of choke points has shifted, but the mechanism remains identical. Singapore today controls passage between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea through the Strait of Malacca, one of the highest volume shipping lanes in the world. It has no significant natural resources, no vast agricultural territory, and a population of under 6 million. And yet it operates one of the most sophisticated financial sectors on Earth, one of the highest concentrations of commercial and logistics infrastructure anywhere, and functions as the capital allocation center for large portions of Southeast Asia. The structure is Venetian: control access to movement, extract value from every layer of that movement. Invest the surplus in institutional depth that makes your position more durable. Repeat, the modern parallel extends beyond physical geography. Digital platforms that control access to networks of buyers and sellers replicated this structure precisely. A technology company that sits between producers and consumers, extracting value from every transaction that passes through its infrastructure, is operating on the same structural logic as the 14th century Venetian port. The mechanism is not metaphorical. The economics are identical. The form of the choke point evolves. The structural advantage of controlling it does not. The history of ports and the empires they surpassed teaches something precise about the nature of economic power. Territory generates extraction. Movement generates multiplication. The empires that controlled vast territories were not poor. They were structurally constrained. Their wealth was tied to what their land could produce. And land, even the most fertile and mineral-rich, yields in linear proportion to its extent. Ports that controlled critical junctions in global trade flows were structurally unconstrained in the same way. Every expansion of global commerce expanded their revenues without requiring them to administer additional territory or deploy additional military force. The lesson that emerges from this long structural history is not that territory is worthless or that empires were irrational. It is that the architecture of wealth depends on what kind of economic flow you are positioned to facilitate. Those who controlled the movement of goods, capital, and information across the most critical choke points of their era consistently accumulated wealth, influence, and institutional sophistication that outlasted the empires surrounding them. The choke point has taken many forms across economic history. A lagoon in the Adriatic, a canal system in the Low Countries, a narrow strait between two oceans. In every case, the structural principle was identical. Wealth does not require owning the world. It requires owning the gateway to it. And once capital learns which gateway controls the flow, history follows.